You didn't open this video randomly. Perhaps you thought it suggested an algorithm. Perhaps you were curious. Or perhaps the title simply caught your attention. But the truth is, the reason you are here right now is not simply because you are looking for new information. Your mind is searching for the answer to a crack it has long carried but couldn't name. What you are about to encounter is not looking at the world from another perspective. It is realizing how perspective itself is formed. And this awareness changes you biologically, not metaphorically. Neuroscience tells us this: when the brain encounters a truth that radically contradicts its existing belief systems, it either rejects it or reorganizes itself. There is no third option. And if reorganization begins, it's not just a change of thought. The connections between neurons are reestablished. Some synaptic pathways weaken, some strengthen. The way the brain perceives reality changes silently but permanently. That's why some people say, "I'm not the same person anymore," after reading a book. That's why some films stay in your mind for days after you watch them. And that's why some truths, once seen, can no longer be ignored. The quantum truth we're going to share here isn't a technical detail hidden behind equations. On the contrary, it's so simple that, when expressed correctly, it leaves your mind vulnerable. Because it's shocking, not because it's complex, but because it's so obvious. Most people learn quantum mechanics piecemeal. They hear about superposition. They know about the observer effect. They are aware of the collapse of the wave function. But they don't realize how these pieces, when put together in a single holistic sense, shatter the concepts we call self, the outside world, and reality. They return to their daily lives. They touch the table and are certain it is solid. They feel like a separate entity within their own bodies. They believe reality is independent of them, easily accessible and stable. This mental detachment is the brain's self-preservation mechanism. Because if this detachment is maintained, the nervous system doesn't need to restructure itself. But now, you are about to encounter a reality that makes this detachment unsustainable. Physics shows us this: the observer is not separate from the observed. Measurement doesn't just record what is, it selects what is. And this selection is an experimental result, not a philosophical interpretation. At this point, many people recoil. Because this awareness is not only informative, it touches on the issue of identity. Who am I? Where does reality begin? Could the world exist without me? These questions are unsettling because the brain loves stability, not truth. A world that is wrong but familiar is safer than a world that is right but unknown. But the consciousness that opened this video has already made a choice. It chose truth, not comfort. It wanted to know, even if everything was turned upside down. Quantum mechanics is not a theory that describes the strange behavior of tiny particles. It is a framework that explains how reality comes into being. And this framework does not exclude you. That's why some scientists have realized that what some mystics intuitively said centuries ago, modern laboratory results lead to the same point. Different languages, different paths, the same truth. The witness is not separate from the witnessed. Consciousness is not a bystander added to the external world afterwards. Reality is shaped through observation. This is not a superficial claim like, "You create everything." This is the fact that in a universe where probabilities are only confirmed through observation, consciousness cannot be passive. Once you fully grasp this, the brain can no longer continue with its old architecture because the old structure cannot carry this information. Restructuring begins quietly, slowly, but irreversibly, just like the red pill in the Matrix movie. Once swallowed, the world is no longer the same. Now take a deep breath, because everyone who has come this far has moved a little further away from their old mental state. And soon, we will approach that quantum reality that is impossible to deny. Get ready. This is not an update. This is a reset. Without being on the right track, you are dissecting reality through observation. I know you feel this, because a person possesses certain information that they think they have chosen, but in reality, this information is a reaction to a pre-prepared state of consciousness. What you are about to encounter is not a new idea or a new perspective. It is a quiet but radical understanding that shakes everything you have accepted about how reality works. And yes, this is not a metaphor. I really mean it. When you realize this, your mind will not just be convinced, your brain will literally begin to reorganize itself. Neuroscience tells us this: when a person encounters a truth that is undeniably powerful but incompatible with their current worldview, the brain is faced with two options. Either it suppresses the truth or it reorganizes itself. And the observing consciousness at this moment is not the consciousness that chooses to suppress, because this truth is as disturbing as it is simple. It is not hidden in complex formulas, inaccessible equations. On the contrary, this truth is so obvious that once seen, it can no longer be ignored. Just like the final scene of a good movie. When you look back, you realize everything was there all along. Quantum mechanics was explained to most people as atoms, particles, and lab experiments. But almost nobody really grasped what it meant for everyday life, because we learned the pieces, but we didn't put the picture together. Wave functions, superposition, uncertainty. These sound technical, so our minds keep them at a safe distance. Until we realize that these pieces actually describe the reality we experience. And now we are at that point. Now you are told you are not a passive observer watching a pre-existing, fixed, and unchanging reality. Reality does not exist exactly before you look. It exists as a field where all possibilities exist simultaneously. And your observation determines which of these possibilities will become experience. This is not a philosophical interpretation. These are the results of quantum mechanics, tested time and time again. The double-slit experiment, delayed choice experiments, quantum eraser studies. They all point to the same thing. Observation doesn't just reveal the truth. Observation determines the truth. What's even more striking is this. In some experiments, even making the observation later changes past appearances. That is, reality doesn't even fit our linear understanding of time. At this point, the mind often begins to resist. Because what we've been taught since childhood is, the world exists, you look at it. But at the quantum level, things don't work that way. Now apply this to your daily life. You think you're looking at a screen right now. It's as if the screen is fixed and you're watching it. But at the quantum level, what you call a screen before you look at it is a potential space where countless possibilities coexist. The text is there. It's not a different color, a different path, all possible at the same time. Your observation reduces these possibilities to a single experience. So you're not discovering what already exists. You're describing the experienced state. This isn't just true for screens. This applies to your body. It applies to other people. It even applies to what you call self. Quantum mechanics tells us that there are no separate, solid entities. There are only interacting patterns of probability. And observation transforms these patterns into experienced reality. At this point, you may feel your brain tense up. This is perfectly normal, because this understanding eliminates the boundary between subject and object. You are not the observer, nor is the world the observed. They are two sides of a single process. Consciousness and matter are not separate things. They are different expressions of the same quantum process. It was no coincidence that ancient teachings said, "The witness and the witnessed are one." They discovered this through experience. Modern science has arrived at the same truth through experimental data. Different paths, the same result. And now we come to this critical point. Understanding this information is not learning something new. It is dismantling the fundamental assumption upon which the brain is built. In other words, it is dismantling the assumption that I am here, the world is there. When this foundation crumbles, everything built upon it, identity, fears, goals, the search for meaning, must be reshaped. This is what is called a big reset. It's not about forgetting everything. It's about recontextualizing everything. It's about not just witnessing the truth, but being aware that you are participating in its emergence. The brain resists this process. It rejects it, compartmentalizes it, and says, "Don't mix this with everyday life." But resistance is not a mistake. Resistance is the old structure's attempt to protect itself. But unless this resistance is overcome, a broader consciousness is not possible. And I can say this: the consciousness watching this video chose the truth, not comfort. It is a consciousness ready to know, even if it turns everything upside down. And once this choice is made, restructuring becomes inevitable, because when the truth is seen, there is no turning back. 5. Resistance models, the mind's self-protection mechanism. It must be clearly stated at this point, if what we have described seems completely comfortable, peaceful, and problem-free to you, it is probably not yet fully understood. Because this kind of quantum understanding shakes the ground the mind is accustomed to. And when shaken, the mind activates automatic defense mechanisms to protect itself. What you'll begin to notice is that these defenses don't appear randomly, but in specific patterns. The first pattern of resistance is intellectual rejection. The mind does this. What's being said might be interesting, but ultimately, it's just an interpretation. Thus, reality is removed from the realm of verified facts and placed in a safe category of opinion. Because opinions aren't threatening, they can be set aside if desired. But the critical point that's overlooked here is this. In quantum mechanics, the fact that observation influences results has been repeatedly confirmed over decades, not just by a single experiment. While different theories offer different explanatory models, whether classical interpretations, multiple probability approaches, or collapse theories, they all converge on one point. Observation is an integral part of the resulting outcome. How the mechanism works may be debatable, but the fact that observation influences reality is no longer a philosophical debate, but an experimental fact. When the mind doesn't want to accept this, it tries to neutralize the truth with a label of interpretation. The second resistance model is compartmentalization. In this defense, the mind says, okay, quantum oddities may exist, but they only apply to subatomic particles. Everyday life doesn't work that way. This is the most common way to salvage the classical worldview. But the simple but unsettling truth overlooked here is that everything you call everyday life is made up of atoms. Your body, your brain, your eyes, your nervous system, all are made up of building blocks that obey quantum rules. At this point, the concept of decoherence is often misunderstood. Decoherence doesn't eliminate the quantum nature. It simply causes states of superposition to rapidly separate on a macroscopic scale. Therefore, the world doesn't cease to be quantum. It simply transforms from a quantum experience to a seemingly classical one. The fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. The scale increases, the appearance simplifies, but the underlying structure is the same. The third resistance model is existential fear. The mind retreats here because it encounters the question, if reality collapses through observation, does that mean I created everything? This thought can lead to a misinterpretation that isolates, even frightens the individual. However, this fear stems from a distortion of quantum reality. Reality is not created by a single consciousness. You are one of countless observation points in an interconnected field. Other consciousnesses also experience reality from their own perspectives. These experiences constantly overlap through quantum entanglement and shared fields. Therefore, you are not creating others. You are experiencing a shared reality within a common field through multiple observations. This is not the illusion of a single God. It is a model of collective participation. The fourth resistance model is avoidance of responsibility. The mind raises the objection. If my observation affects reality, then am I responsible for the bad things that happen? This thought triggers feelings of guilt, and the mind quickly retreats. However, there is a crucial distinction here. Participating in reality doesn't mean consciously controlling every detail. Most collapses are unconscious. Past events, physical laws, collective dynamics, and environmental interactions shape probability distributions. Consciousness is part of this process, but it is not an absolute control center. This understanding doesn't blame the individual. On the contrary, it saves them from being a helpless victim. Responsibility isn't about creating everything, but about recognizing how one participates. The fifth and deepest pattern of resistance is existential instability. If reality is unstable, who am I? If I am not a separate entity, what can I rely on? At this point, the mind feels the ground shifting. Identity, time, the sense of certainty begin to dissolve. This is perceived as loss. However, this dissolution is a prerequisite for reconstruction. The old foundation was comfortable but wrong. The new foundation is initially uncomfortable but closer to the truth. Instability is inevitable in this transition process. Instead of trying to suppress it, it is necessary to recognize it. Observe the rejecting thoughts, fears, and escapes. Don't fight them. Don't judge them. Just see them as they are. Because perceived resistance no longer controls you. The brain completes its restructuring in its own time. Trying to forcibly eliminate resistance only creates more resistance, but acceptance creates space. And in this space, reality slowly but permanently takes root. In short, reality is not a magical power. Consciousness does not create everything as it wishes. But consciousness is not insignificant either. You are not entirely outside of what is happening in the quantum realm of probability. Your participation is limited, but it is real. And this carries a much deeper meaning than the classical worldview acknowledges. My personal experiences in the process of mental transformation. Through the Great Reset, I first heard this truth not in a book or a spiritual narrative, but in a physics seminar that seemed cold, technical, and utterly mundane. Until then, I was not unfamiliar with quantum mechanics. I had studied the equations, knew the experiments, and could mathematically explain why particles behave strangely. But unknowingly, I was perpetuating a critical error. I was perceiving quantum strangeness as something belonging only to particles, leaving the world I was experiencing within the safe zone of classical reality. In other words, I had two separate universes in my mind: the quantum universe in the laboratory and the real world I lived in. Until the professor, as if it were an ordinary sentence, uttered a statement that shattered this distinction. You are not observing an independent reality. Through observation, you are transforming the field of probability into experienced reality. And this is true not only for particles, but also for your life and your body. This sentence demolished the mental wall I had unconsciously built over the years with a single blow. I didn't experience an enlightenment. On the contrary, the first thing I felt was disorientation. If my observation affects reality so fundamentally, what exists when I don't observe? If reality is only the probability before collapse, is this probability something or an abstract probability? If other people are collapsing their own realities, how can the world I experience remain consistent with theirs? Questions began to come much faster than answers. And the most unsettling part was this: the old mental foundation that supported these questions had vanished. The idea of a separate, independent self observing the world from a safe distance had collapsed, but a new foundation hadn't yet been built in its place. This void, this space between dissolution and reconstruction, that was the hardest part. This period was sometimes confusing, sometimes unsettling, even frightening at times. But then I realized it wasn't a dissolution. It was a rupture, just like renovating a house you live in. The old structure had been dismantled, so it was messy. But this chaos was a prerequisite for a more functional order. My daily experiences began to change. When I looked at an object, I realized I no longer perceived it as something independent, standing there, but as a momentarily collapsed possibility. When I spoke with a person, I began to experience it not as an external encounter between two separate selves, but as the emergence of a shared reality through mutual observation. Physics ceased to be an abstract subject and became visible in life itself. It took about 3 months for this restructuring to stabilize. Initially, perception fluctuated between the classical worldview and the quantum understanding. Sometimes the world solidified again, feeling like a separate reality with clear boundaries. At other times, everything was perceived as a fluid field of possibilities shaped by observation. Over time, this oscillation lessened. Quantum understanding ceased to be a special state of consciousness and became a fundamental basis. I no longer constantly think about quantum mechanics, but perception automatically knows this. I am not passively observing a predetermined world. I am participating in the emergence of reality through observation. This wasn't a return to the old normal, This was quantum becoming the new normal. This awareness created a radical change in my relationship with life. I no longer feel like a powerless witness to conditions beyond my control. I am not omnipotent, but I am not entirely powerless either. I am a being who participates in what is happening through consciousness. Events don't happen to me. Events arise from a complex process of interaction in which I am also involved. I wish someone had told me this sooner. That disorientation is not a malfunction, but a temporary and necessary adjustment process. That I haven't severed my connection with reality, but rather adapted to its deeper nature. That old neural pathways are being reorganized around the false assumption that I am a separate entity and that these need to be resolved. Reorganization creates instability in the short term, but this instability, once complete, transforms into a more solid, more real, and more empowering understanding. Therefore, don't resist disorientation. Don't fight the confusion. Don't try to retreat into comforting but false certainties. Allow the process to complete. Your reorganization may be smoother or more intense than mine. It may happen faster or slower, but the mechanism is the same. Encountering a reality that is incompatible with one's worldview requires the brain to reorganize in order to adapt. That is the true meaning of the big reset. It's not about forgetting everything. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about recontextualizing everything you know around the fact that you are no longer a separate witness, but an entity participating in the unfolding of reality. And when you reach this point, it's impossible to believe again that you're merely observing an independent external world, because now you've seen the reality that makes that belief unsustainable. 6. Essential practices to strengthen brain. Recoding. Major shifts in consciousness begin when the mind becomes trapped between old maps and new reality. The most common mistake at these threshold moments is to retreat to the familiar and seemingly safe classical worldview when a sense of uncertainty arises. But this retreat interrupts the transformation itself. Neural restructuring is completed not just by thinking, but by directly experiencing. Conceptually, understanding quantum reality is a start, but the brain needs lived, felt, and perceived experiences to adopt the new structure. As neuroscientists often emphasize, the brain changes not through theories, but through repeated experiences. Many scientists share a common theme in their lab notes and personal accounts. True transformation begins not when the mind says, "I understand this," but when it says, "I am experiencing this." The following practices are designed to build precisely this experiential foundation. 1. Observation. Awareness. Focusing, not just on what is being observed, but on the observation itself. Most people focus only on the content, the words read, the images seen, the sounds heard. But what is invited here is to step back from the content. As you read these lines, instead of just trying to understand, become aware of the act of reading itself. The moment you feel your attention shifting to the screen, your consciousness interacting with the words, an observation taking place as an active process, you realize you are not a passive receiver. This awareness is a turning point alluded to in many philosophical texts and even modern films. Like the shock experienced by the characters in The Matrix. The problem is not the visible world, but how you experience it. Observation awareness allows the brain to begin saying, "I'm not just watching, I'm participating." 2. Pre-observation awareness. the moment before the event. In daily life, we experience most things automatically, but every experience has an uncertain moment just before it happens. Before entering a room, pause and feel the uncertain nature of the space that has not yet been observed. At that moment, potential is abundant, but not certain. Then step in and notice how a particular experience emerges through observation. This simple awareness opens a door from everyday life to what is called the pre-measurement state in quantum physics. Before you look at the clock, time is uncertain. The moment you look, a specific value emerges. Through these repeated experiences, the brain begins to realize, not just intellectually, but intuitively, that reality is shaped by observation. 3. Perception of probability, feeling the openness before collapse. Consider the moment before making a decision. You haven't yet decided which word to say, which direction to go. This moment is the realm of possibilities. The goal of this exercise is to pause just before making a decision and consciously feel that multiple outcomes are possible. Then make a choice and observe how that choice reduces a vast field of possibilities to a single concrete experience. This awareness, which seems simple in everyday life, helps the brain recognize a profound truth. Certainty emerges through observation and choice. This intuition forms the basis of the intellectual breakdowns experienced by many great scientists, especially in the post-Einstein era. 4. Observation, variation. The same situation, different realities. Try looking at the same scene in different ways. First, observe it generally. Then, focus on just a particular color. Next, aim to notice movement, patterns, or aesthetic details. The physical environment remains unchanged, but your experience is significantly different. This practice reveals a fundamental truth addressed in many documentaries and art films. Reality is not a fixed object, but an experience shaped by the direction of observation. When the brain experiences this difference repeatedly, it begins to loosen the assumption of a single and unchanging world. 5. Conscious intention, choosing what you want to see. Before entering a space, set a silent intention for what you want to notice. Beauty, connection, opportunity, or learning. Then observe with that intention. You will notice how the experience differs compared to a purely coincidental observation. Of course, you can't control everything. It's not magic. However, this practice intuitively teaches that consciousness not only records what happens, but also influences which possibilities become experience. Many things we call chance in everyday life are actually related to directed attention. 6. Collective observation, the birth of shared reality. Observe an experience with someone else and then compare your experiences. You will often agree consistently. However, the details will differ. This points to a shared experience resulting from related observations rather than a single absolute reality. This awareness balances the fallacy of "I create everything alone" with the thought of "I am entirely a victim." Reality is a participatory process. We observe together, we collapse together, and we shape together. This understanding takes humanity out of isolation and places it in an interactive existence. Result: a new normal. Close your eyes. What you will see is uncertain. Then open your eyes and realize the room is empty. This simple act helps the brain recognize a very fundamental truth. Observation does not reveal a pre-completed world. It transforms potential into experience. Through repeated practice, the nervous system begins to reorganize itself not as a separate witness, but as a participating consciousness. This process may create temporary imbalance, but ultimately, a more consistent, resilient, and empowering perception emerges. The new normal is not a return to old certainties. It is a conscious partnership with uncertainty. The inevitable phase of uncertainty in the transformation process. When the brain undergoes restructuring, a very critical phase begins for which most people are not mentally or emotionally prepared. This phase is not a collapse or disintegration, as is often misunderstood. Rather, it is a necessary transitional phase where a new structure cannot be built without dissolving the old one. What is lost in this process is not information. What is lost is the sense of certainty previously accepted without question. This is not just uncertainty about quantum mechanics, the nature of reality, or the role of consciousness. It goes much deeper. Fundamental assumptions you never considered before. For example, the continuity of what you call self, whether the past truly existed, whether others exist independently of you, or whether it is possible to trust anything, begin to be shaken. What happens at this point is not the loss of consciousness, but the loss of the old foundation of consciousness. Just as an old building must have its internal supports removed before it collapses, old certainties are dissolved before new foundations can be established. And if what is happening is not understood, this unraveling can force a return to the classical worldview, which is wrong but familiar. Because the mind fears uncontrollable emptiness more than uncertainty. The questions that arise at this stage are not simple. If reality is a probability that collapses through observation, do you continue to exist in moments when you are not observing? When you do not perceive your body, does the body remain in a specific state, or does it return to the realm of probabilities? When you sleep, does the world truly continue? Or is this continuity merely a mental assumption? While these questions may seem philosophical at first glance, they have counterparts in quantum physics. Delayed choice experiments show that observation can influence not only the future, but even events that seem to have happened in the past. This raises the possibility that the past may not be a fixed record as we imagine it, but a network of probabilities shaped by current observation. Is memory concerned with producing meaning that collapses in the present, rather than storing a lived history? At this point, uncertainty sometimes turns to the past, and sometimes to the existence of others. If you are transforming reality into experience through observation, do other people exist independently of your observation? Do they maintain a definite existence when they are not with you? Or do they exist only as a possibility? Do they participate in the process by collapsing reality with their own observations? Quantum mechanics confirms that other consciousnesses are independent points of observation through quantum correlations and entanglement. If other people were merely patterns you created, these correlations could not coherently exist. However, since this assurance has not yet been integrated into the reconstruction process, the mind may temporarily fall into a realm of uncertainty resembling solipsism. The task at this stage is not to cling to answers, but to allow not to know. The classical worldview offers quick and comforting answers to these questions. You are continuous. The past is fixed. Others are independent. But these answers are based on the assumption of an objective and independent reality. Quantum understanding invalidates these comforting certainties. but it takes time for more functional, deeper, and more accurate certainties to emerge in their place. During this transition, you exist as a constantly reweaving pattern in the quantum realm, while the past persists as traces of probability influencing the present. Other people interacting with you exist as independent points of observation, producing a shared reality. But as old certainties dissolve and new ones are yet to form, an uncertainty gap emerges. This gap is not a mistake. This gap is the restructuring itself. Certainty based on a false foundation is not wisdom. It is merely comforting ignorance. The uncertainty born from confronting reality is a more mature state of consciousness. Childlike understanding wants to see the world as simple, clear, and certain. But adult consciousness has the breadth to handle paradox, complexity, and uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a regression. It is a progression from false simplicity to true complexity. In my own experience, this phase lasted about 2 months. I constantly questioned whether I was truly there, whether I was emerging with each observation. I wondered if my memories were a fixed past or meanings collapsing in the present. I repeatedly questioned whether others truly existed or were merely forms manifesting in my experience. This process was sometimes frightening, sometimes overwhelming, but eventually, the brain sufficiently restructured itself and new certainties emerged. These were not classical certainties. Human consciousness is undergoing a simultaneous evolution. The experiences you have at an individual level, as your brain restructures around quantum reality, are not isolated, personal events unique to you. Simultaneously, thousands of people in different parts of the world are undergoing a similar process of internal dissolution, disintegration, and restructuring. This is no coincidence. This is a silent but profound threshold crossing in humanity's cognitive evolution. What at first glance appears to be personal awareness is actually part of a larger movement transforming the collective field. The classical worldview was organized around the assumptions of the separate subject, objective reality, and passive observer. However, when enough people directly experience that these assumptions are not valid at the quantum level, not only individual minds, but also the collective cognitive structure begins to reorganize. At this point, Rupert Sheldrake's concept of morphic resonance gains meaning. When a behavior, a form of perception, or a cognitive structure is adopted by enough individuals, an invisible but effective field is created. This field makes the process more accessible, more familiar, and less destructive for those who will undergo the same transformation. The first person walks in the dark. The second finds an indistinct trail. After thousands pass, a path forms. Those who first encountered quantum reality experienced this transformation almost unsupported. There was no language, conceptual framework, or cultural context to validate this experience. Therefore, many pioneers experienced this process as a cognitive shock, even a temporary disintegration. However, unknowingly, they left a pattern in the collective field. Today, this pattern has strengthened. From physicists integrating quantum physics into neural structures, to mystics directly experiencing non-duality, from consciousness researchers to ordinary people who confront this reality solely through experience without an academic background, a wide range of people have nourished this field. If you can listen to this conversation now, You can do so with less resistance thanks to the traces left by those who came before you. This situation takes your individual restructuring beyond being merely a personal gain. When you complete this process, when your brain reorganizes around an understanding of a conscious subject participating in reality through observation, you also strengthen the collective field. Your integration softens the transition somewhat for someone else who hasn't yet encountered this reality. A rare convergence in human history also makes this process unique. Quantum literacy is no longer a marginal area of interest. Quantum computing is becoming mainstream technology. Quantum biology shows that processes in living systems are not limited by classical explanations. In neuroscience, theories that consciousness is not merely a byproduct are gaining increasing acceptance. So you're not reorganizing around an unverified belief. Instead, you're undergoing a transformation around an understanding of reality that is increasingly aligned with the latest physics and neuroscience research. This reduces mental resistance. It makes the reorganization less lonely, less isolated, and more sustainable because there is now a community that shares this understanding. Your individual big reset is the leading wave of collective cognitive evolution. When enough people complete this process, quantum understanding becomes a cultural foundation. The idea that the world is round, once a radical thought, is now a universally accepted truth. We are approaching that threshold. However, this process is not automatic. During restructuring, you are faced with a choice: to allow uncertainty or to return to the comforting but false classical certainty, to temporarily accept not knowing or to cling to old answers. This choice cannot be made by the ego. The ego craves certainty. It wants to preserve the familiar. It relies on the illusion of a separate self. That is why it perceives restructuring as a threat. This truth hasn't been proven, it says. It's not useful in everyday life, it says. It's impractical to live according to this, it says. These are all attempts by the ego to protect itself. But once consciousness sees quantum truth, it cannot truly forget it. You can suppress it, postpone it, distance yourself from it, but you cannot innocently return to old beliefs. Therefore, an incomplete restructuring can be more painful than a complete one, because consciousness remains divided between two worlds. Old traditions describe this period as a dark night or a crisis of faith. It's an interim phase where the old structure is dissolving, but the new one hasn't yet stabilized. You can't build a new house on an old foundation. Demolition is necessary first. But during demolition, you are temporarily without a foundation. This lack of a foundation is frightening, but it's temporary. You either trust this process or you panic and rebuild the false stability. For a consciousness that has seen quantum reality, returning to the classical worldview creates a particular pain, because now you know the truth, but you are running away from it. In the 4th month of restructuring, I faced this choice. I could have chosen the easy way. I could have given up uncertainty and clung to the old certainty. But consciousness knew that this would create a deeper dissonance. So I chose to allow the restructuring to complete. I chose to endure months of uncertainty, not knowing, and dissolution. And finally, the neural structure stabilized around the new reality. The resulting understanding was far more liberating than the classical worldview could ever offer. The pain of restructuring is temporary. The impact of an integrated quantum understanding is permanent. experiencing life with a transformed quantum mind. When the nervous system is reorganized with quantum reality at its center, the resulting state of consciousness is not only different from classical thought, it is also akin to a radically different operating system. This new cognition is not always comfortable or easy. Rather, it is more intertwined with uncertainty, decidedly less nurturing, and therefore initially challenging for the mind. But this difficulty is a side effect of a perception more faithful to the nature of reality. Classical consciousness perceives the world as a fixed and external scene, independent of the observer. Objects are there, events happen, and you simply watch. But in quantum-based cognition, this distinction begins to dissolve. Reality is no longer something that stands there. It is experienced as a field of possibilities that is constantly forming, collapsing, and reshaping itself moment by moment with observation. When you look at something, you no longer automatically accept it as objective and independent. Consciousness intuitively perceives that what it sees existed as a possibility before it was noticed. The act of seeing isn't just about gathering information. It's about revealing reality in a particular way. It's not a mental theory, but a directly experienced shift in perception. At this point, you understand why many ideas that many people see as science fiction are powerful metaphors. For example, the moment of rupture Neo experiences in The Matrix isn't a change in reality, but a change in perception. The world is the same world, but the mind operating within it is different. Quantum consciousness creates a similar transformation. The scene doesn't change, but the mechanism that sets the scene becomes visible. Classical perception presents the world as a solid structure, but quantum perception sees a constantly moving flow shaped by observation. This radically alters self-perception. It becomes difficult to feel yourself as a separate, fixed, and central self. Instead, consciousness begins to recognize itself as a pattern emerging in the quantum field. This doesn't mean the self disappears. The self is still present. It makes decisions, plans, and forms relationships. But it is no longer perceived as an absolute reality, but as a functional tool. Just like a map. It's useful, but it's not the terrain itself. At the quantum level, there is no clear line between self and reality. Both are different concentrations of the same field. Both are processes, not static entities. In physics, this is called field vibrations. In consciousness, it is felt as a continuous flow of experience. This shift in perception also redefines causality. The classical worldview sees events as a mechanical chain of events. A happens, then B inevitably occurs. But in the quantum understanding, events don't produce a single outcome. They form a distribution of probabilities. An observation plays an active role in determining which outcome will emerge from this distribution. At this point, one ceases to feel like a passive product of the past. The past is still influential, but not the absolute determinant. Your current perspective, what you focus on and notice, influences which of the past probabilities will become reality. Therefore, the perception of time also changes. Time is no longer felt like a linear line, but like layers of interwoven probabilities. The past, rather than being a fixed story, becomes a potential pattern interacting with the present. The future is experienced not as a predetermined fate, but as a realm shaped by your current observations. The emphasis on being in the moment in many mystical traditions takes on scientific meaning here. Because at the quantum level, collapse only occurs in the now. Reality is determined only in the present moment, neither in the past nor in the future. This awareness frees one from the victim mentality. Classical consciousness perceives conditions as external and imposed. However, quantum consciousness is aware of its own role in the emergence of conditions. This does not mean that everything is your fault. On the contrary, it develops a mature understanding that separates responsibility from guilt. This understanding also removes the concept of manifestation from being a mystical technique. Manifestation is not a practice performed at specific moments. It is a process that operates at every moment. Every thought, every focus of attention, every observation creates small but continuous effects in the quantum field. A restructured brain perceives that this process is constantly working. This involvement, unnoticed in classical consciousness, is now visible. Therefore, for someone with this perception, reality is neither random nor entirely uncontrollable. However, it is not entirely controllable either. The delicate balance is this. And if what I'm saying feels less like new information and more like a reminder of something you already knew but had forgotten, it's no coincidence. Because this kind of content is more about reminding than teaching. That's why I want you to join this space, this frequency, and this shared consciousness. Subscribing here isn't just a channel activity. It's a conscious participation in this restructuring process. It's not just an audience that's forming here. It's a network of consciousness that copes with uncertainty, understands each other, and experiences transformation together. Living with a restructured brain means perceiving reality not as a fixed object, but as a collapsing possibility. Recognizing oneself not as a rigid identity, but as a functional pattern. Experiencing causality not as mechanical fate, but as a participatory process. Feeling time not as an inevitable line, but as a fluid space. This isn't a constant state of mystical intoxication. This is the brain's natural functioning after restructuring. And from this point, there's literally no turning back. Because consciousness, at the neural level, truly cannot forget an integrated reality. It can be suppressed, postponed, but it cannot return to its former innocence. And perhaps for the first time, reality is truly becoming visible. Why mental restructuring can no longer be reversed. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself, is not limited to learning new information. It also transforms the physical infrastructure of perception, meaning, and the interpretation of reality. When people first encounter quantum reality, this new perspective initially seems weak and alien compared to the neural networks built on old, classical assumptions. The world still seems outside. The self still seems inside. This is because the brain has repeatedly reinforced these distinction-based pathways over the years. However, the situation changes when the shift in perception becomes not just an idea, but a practice. When you repeatedly realize that the possibility of observation transforms into a specific experience. When you confirm, not abstractly, but through experience, that consciousness is not a passive observer, but an active component of the process, the brain begins to create pathways suitable for this new functioning. Old neural networks aren't instantly erased, but they weaken if unused. However, with each awareness, each intuitive understanding, new pathways are strengthened. In neuroscience, this is called the use it or lose it principle. Just as a muscle weakens when not used for a long time, unused perceptual pathways fade into the background. At a certain point, neural pathways organized around quantum perception become dominant. Once this threshold is crossed, the transformation becomes irreversible because the brain no longer expends extra effort to maintain quantum perception. On the contrary, returning to classical perception requires effort. After this stage, perceiving reality as an objective and independent world ceases to be the default state. The brain automatically processes experience within a probability observation collapse framework. This is not a temporary perspective, but a processing method embedded in the neural architecture. You can no longer learn to ignore how consciousness shapes reality. You may temporarily forget. Attention may narrow. Stress or fatigue may bring classical perception to the forefront. But this is not a true return to old belief. This situation can be illustrated with a very familiar example from the history of science. After Copernicus, someone who understood the heliocentric model of the universe could practically continue to say, "The sun is rising," but they could not truly believe that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Because the knowledge had changed not only thought, but also the fundamental structure of thought. Similarly, a restructured brain cannot fully take the classical worldview seriously. Another reason for this irreversibility is the release of previously inaccessible cognitive capacities. For example, being able to intuitively perceive before an event occurs that it is not a single outcome, but a field of possibilities. Or realizing that observation has an immediate effect on outcomes. These are not learned techniques. They are natural byproducts of a restructured system. Classical cognition filters the quantum field underlying reality. This filtering is useful for everyday functions, but it also limits perception. After restructuring, these filters loosen. People feel the uncertainty, the flow, and the potential behind the apparent order more clearly. Reality is no longer experienced as a mechanical machine, but as a participatory process. At this point, an interesting feedback loop emerges. Some work in the field of quantum neuroscience suggests that microtubules in neurons, particularly in the theories of Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, can maintain quantum coherence for longer than expected, despite biological conditions. In other words, the brain may not be entirely closed to quantum processes. What is even more striking is this. When a person begins to recognize themselves not as a separate solid entity, but as a quantum process, the quantum coherence of the brain can increase. This creates a cycle where quantum understanding supports deeper quantum functions. Understanding feeds biology, and biology feeds understanding. The saying, "You are what you know yourself to be," takes on not only a philosophical, but also a functional meaning here. Therefore, someone who has undergone such a restructuring cannot completely revert to the unconscious classical worldview, even years later. Classical perception may still emerge, but it is no longer perceived as absolute truth. It is perceived as a limited and practical perspective. Just like knowing that a map is not the terrain itself. You cannot completely eliminate the illusion of observing an objective world as a separate self. Because when you clearly see that consciousness is constantly collapsing this possibility, you cannot ignore it. This is not an intellectual idea. it is a perceptual transformation. Therefore, restructuring is not a temporary state of thought that consciousness can enter and exit. This is a lasting change rooted in neural architecture. If you feel this in your own experience, it's not a promise of the future, but a sign of a transformation happening right now. That's precisely the purpose of this channel, to support the brain in processing reality on a more accurate basis, rather than perpetuating classical fallacy. Every narrative, every example, every metaphor serves to reorganize cognition around quantum reality. This is not a belief system, but an evolution of perception. And this transformation is powerful even when it remains individual. When it becomes collective, the field itself begins to change. The more minds experience this reorganization, the more reality begins to reflect this understanding. Everything described so far has been moving toward this point. The global mental reset process officially begins. The Great Reset is not an event destined to happen someday in the future, nor is it a possibility lurking in a corner of the mind. The Great Reset has either been initiated right now, the moment you come into contact with these words, or it has been delayed because consciousness has chosen to cling to an old and comfortable yet flawed worldview. For this process depends not on time, but on awareness. The brain either begins to reorganize itself according to quantum reality, or it maintains the old assumption that it is a separate observer watching an independent, objective reality. Now pause for a brief moment. Take a deep breath. Take this breath not merely to relax the body, but to allow the truth to settle deeper. For you are not a passive witness watching a pre-written script. You are a participating consciousness that transforms the field of possibility into reality, experienced through observation. This awareness is not intellectual knowledge. It is a recognition that shifts the center of existence. At the quantum level, there is no reality that exists before it is observed. What exists is a superpositional space where all possibilities exist simultaneously. Reality does not exist in a particular form before you observe it. Your observation selects a single experience from this sea of possibilities and transforms it into a lived certainty. In other words, you don't discover what already exists. You determine what will emerge through observation. Don't think of this as an abstract theory. You are able to read these lines right now because your observation transforms possibility into experienced words. You feel your body because your observation transforms possibility into sensations. The space you are in feels real to you because observation transforms possibility into an experienced environment. Without observation, none of this could gain certainty. At this point, it is important to realize you are not passive. You are not merely someone watching what is happening. You are an active participant. In every moment, in every perception, you bring reality into existence. This is not a claim made to impose responsibility. It is a truth that reminds us of freedom. In the coming days, you will begin to notice moments when the mind attempts to revert to classical perception. The world may once again appear independent, rigid, and separate from you. The self may again feel trapped in a small, isolated spot. The thought that everything already exists and you are merely observing may return. These are not moments when the process breaks down, but moments when the restructuring deepens. At such moments, do not try to force anything on yourself. Just gently remind yourself, I am not a separate witness. I am a participating consciousness that collapses the possibility through observation. This reminder is not a mantra. It is the reintroduction of accurate information to the nervous system. When classical perception emerges, it is about recognizing the truth without force or struggle. It is about allowing the brain to reorganize itself, not around false assumptions, but around a more accurate understanding. At this point, one thing becomes clear. After truly making contact with quantum reality, the brain resets. This is not a possibility. It is inevitable, because this reality is incompatible with the existing worldview. And once directly grasped, it cannot remain there without creating a change at the neural level. The brain cannot maintain two contradictory foundations simultaneously. It either abandons the old structure or suppresses the truth. Suppression is possible, but the cost is high. Restructuring is unsettling, but it is also integrative. Therefore, the Great Reset is not a collapse. It is a transition to a more accurate organization. It is a restructuring of the foundation of the brain, perception, and meaning. If this transmission has triggered something in you, if you feel yourself not as a separate witness, but as a participant creating reality, if this information affects not only your thoughts, but also your perception, then the restructuring has begun. At this point, sharing is important because many people are ready, but have not yet encountered a truth clear enough, direct, and unfiltered to initiate the Great Reset. Sharing is not just about helping others. When you articulate this understanding, you also strengthen your own neural pathways. Just like a muscle, expressed understanding strengthens. When disorientation begins, instead of retreating into old comfort zones, allowing the process to complete makes transformation possible. Therefore, now, consider a single word that represents the energy you choose as you step into this Great Reset. This is not an interpretation. It is a sign of conscious participation. It is a trace you leave in the quantum field with your observation, intention, and choice. This is about accepting that the brain is restructuring itself around quantum reality. It's about embracing the fact that you are a participating consciousness, not a separate witness. This acceptance triggers lasting changes in the nervous system, because meaning is no longer on the surface, but fundamental. Returning to this content in the coming days will allow this truth to become more deeply ingrained in the neural structure each time. And if you have someone in your life ready for this understanding, share it. Not as information, but as a frequency, an invitation, a connection. Because when you share quantum reality, you're not just supporting the awakening of another consciousness, you're also strengthening the collective field. As this field strengthens, synchronicities increase, the process accelerates, and transformation feels less alone. This is the Great Reset. This is the brain's shift from witnessing to participating. This is the neural awareness that reality is emerging with you, not separately from you. This is the shift from passive observer to creative participant. Do you understand now? Understanding has occurred. The Great Reset has begun. And what will emerge when this process is complete will not be a consciousness limited by classical misunderstandings, but an existence in harmony with quantum reality. Welcome to quantum cognition. Welcome to the Great Reset.